Welcome back to Emu Ridge, and in this video we will be discussing the revolvers of World War I. By 1914, most armies around the world had adopted some form of semi-automatic pistol, but as the technology had only been around for just shy of 20 years by this point, old revolver stocks and designs still remained the dominant choice in both policing and a vast majority of militaries operating at the time, especially in Britain, where the Webley revolvers were the dominant design. This video will be somewhat different from my repeating handguns history series, as this video will be mostly subjective since it is based on a ranking criteria I have devised for deciding which handguns are better and which ones are worse. That being said, for the vast majority of people, the M1879 Reich revolver is going to be worse than the Webley Mark VI. However, if you disagree, then feel free to let me know why in the comments. I will briefly cover the criteria for my rankings of the World War I revolvers. However, if you would like to get straight into the rankings, feel free to skip ahead. I've left a timestamp in the description of this video. There are 7 distinct criteria I have set up, with each criteria having a point value set to it, with the lowest possible number of points being 7, and the highest possible number of points being 19. Each individual criterion will feature between 2 or 4 tiers. The lowest possible tier will award 1 point, while subsequent tiers award incrementally increasing points. First criteria is capacity, 3 different tiers, 1 point for 5 rounds or less, 2 points for 6 rounds, and 3 points for 7 rounds or more. Having a high capacity is important as revolvers can often be very slow to load, and firing as many shots as possible before reloading is important, because it maximizes your chances of survival when outnumbered by the enemy. Second criterion is caliber, which has 4 different tiers, 8mm or less for 1 point, 2 points for 9mm, 3 points for 10mm, and 4 points for 11mm or more. Having a chambering and a high caliber is important, as revolvers often cover the base that semi-automatics can't, stopping power. Third criterion is action. Single action receives 1 point while double action receives 2 points. The reason why double action can be seen as better here is because all of the revolvers mentioned here have exposed hammers, so having a fast action is important because it allows more shots to be fired compared to a slower single action, potentially saving a soldier's life. Fourth criterion is loading. 1 point for gate loading, 2 points for break open, and 3 points for swing out. Loading method is very important because it essentially dictates whether or not reloading a gun in battle is tenable. While both break and swing open loading methods are quick, swing open has the edge, primarily because swing open designs typically have stronger frames that can chamber more powerful rounds. The fifth criterion is ammunition, 1 point for black powder and 2 points for smokeless propellant. Having smokeless ammo isn't the most important trait, but it does often create more powerful cartridges which don't cause noticeable plumes of smoke when fired. Sixth criterion is availability. 1 point if the weapon uses a proprietary cartridge, and 2 points if the weapon shares its cartridge with other weapons. Having a shared cartridge is important, as this means the weapon can be reloaded more readily, and can even be reloaded with cartridges obtained from the enemy. The seventh and final criteria is age. While this criteria has the least relevance to the gun itself, it is an important point since newer guns tend to have quicker reloading mechanisms, more powerful smokeless rounds, and faster and more reliable actions. 1 point for guns made before 1878, 2 points for guns made between 1879 and 1894, and 3 points for guns made between 1895 and 1918. The non-optimal tier refers to guns which have scored less than 12 points, and non-optimal in this context essentially means that while all of these guns are more than capable of killing a man in a single shot, they are far worse than other options later on the list. M1879 and M1883 cavalry Reich revolvers could be argued as being the worst revolvers of World War I. Shouldn't surprise anyone as to why they are so maligned. The redeeming features of the Reich revolver include its use of a 10mm round, but aside from that the weapon is poor in every other regard. It's heavy, uses a slow single action, has a suboptimal reloading system, and does all of these things while being made in 1879. Faster loading methods on guns such as the Smith & Wesson No. 3 already existed. Context for the Reich revolver between 1914 and 1918 is also very important here too. Germany had already produced several different semi-automatic pistols by the outbreak of the First World War, not just the P08 and the C96, but also a huge array of 32 caliber pocket pistols as well. The Reich revolver was surrounded by better alternatives and really had no excuse. It wasn't even the only German-made revolver used in World War I, adding further insult to injury. The Gasser series has several incarnations, some of which possess small 5-round cylinders, others are chambered for 10mm or less, and some are even double action. I'll be using the Gasser M1870 as the baseline to judge every other Gasser, since it was the most produced version. The M1870 version was a single action in 11mm, a 6-round cylinder. The Gasser suffers many of the same problems of the Reich revolver, including slow loading and heavy weight, and even being the worst choice when it comes down to the revolver revolver of its nation. Where the Gasser and the Reich revolver diverges in the Gasser's usage of a more powerful 11mm cartridge, and the Gasser being significantly older, made 9 years before in 1870. Due to the difference in stopping power, the Gasser M1870 slightly edges out the Reich revolver. Maybe you're surprised to see the Webley British Bulldog so low on the list, but a lot of the problems with the British Bulldog come down to problems with the weapon as both being made in 1872 and being intentionally designed as a compact snub-nosed revolver. Compared to the Gasser and the Reich revolver, the Bulldog has a number of benefits, despite almost being as old as the Gasser. It's a double action, fairly lightweight, and shares a cartridge with the earlier Webley RIC, but its problems are what drags it back down to being a poor choice. Not only is it old, but it also has a slow loading mechanism, uses black powder rounds, and possesses the lowest capacity of any revolver on this list, at 5 rounds. This would make the Bulldog a poor choice, especially compared to other Webley revolvers, even if it still has high stopping power and a fast fire rate. Questionable tier refers to weapons which are generally superior to the non-optimal tier, but still have problems that prevent them from being considered better. Like tier 1, these weapons tend to be on the older side, but older weapons here have some slightly more redeeming qualities, while newer weapons here are let down by many different factors. These weapons have all attained 12 points. This revolver is the second worst double action of World War I, although compared to the Bulldog it has an advantage in having 6 rounds in a cylinder rather than 5, shares many of the same traits as the Bulldog, an 11mm caliber, a double action, and a gate loading mechanism, and was even slightly older, made in 1871. The weapon was fairly heavy and outdated and was still used in Serbian service by the outbreak of World War I, despite the growing replacement of the weapon by semi-automatic pistols and the Nagant revolver. While the Mars 1873 is remarkable for its durability and reliability, it does have a number of flaws that prevent it from being anything better than a questionable choice. First to consider must be that the Mars 1873 chambers 11mm rounds, which unfortunately happen to be underpowered black powder rounds. The Mars 1873 is better than the Lefaucheux Francot M71 though, as not only did it see service beyond France, but it influenced the Glicenti M1874 revolver and would be far more widespread than the Lefaucheux Francot M71, making it easier to find ammunition for the Mars 1873. The decision to place the Nagant right in the middle of the questionable tier may either be too low or too high for most people, but as a revolver the Nagant has its ups and downs. The most notable positive trait of the Nagant is its high capacity of 7 rounds and its use of the modern 7.62 by 38mm cartridge, which could be suppressed, although it is highly unlikely that any suppressed Nagant revolvers actually saw service in World War I. Despite having a high capacity and being fairly modern for a revolver used in the Great War, the Nagant was very slow to use, the round it used was of the smallest caliber seen on the list, and it was a single action made past the 1880s. For a revolver, the Nagant has positives, but overall is a questionable choice primarily because of its smaller caliber and slower firing and reloading. Placing the Colt's single-action army at questionable is likely to raise some eyebrows, but considering that the Great War took place almost entirely in the Old World, and that it had to compete among far better revolvers and pistols already in use by the US Army, the Colt's single-action army was overall a good but ultimately outdated weapon. Single-action gate loader in the powerful 45 Colt round was simply 2 or 3 whole decades out of date by the time World War I rolled around. Given the rather standard capacity and slow loading, the Colt single-action army is still as flashy and effective as ever, however it was far superseded by most of the modern handguns around it. Considering how similar they are, the single-action army and Gasser M1870 are essentially parallels of each other from different parts of the world. The Mauser C78 and C86 zigzag revolvers were part of a line of German revolvers cut from the same cloth as the Reich revolver series, and in fact competed alongside the Reich revolver. The Reich revolver ultimately won over the C78 due to the greater simplicity of the Reich revolver, but some C78 revolvers were privately purchased for usage in World War I. Ultimately, the C78 was better than the Reich revolver, as it used a tip-up system to reload and extract rounds, sort of an inverse to the earlier Smith & Wesson No. 3 revolvers released earlier in the 1870s. The zigzag is still pretty poor by revolver standards though, as it was a single action that used black powder rounds. While being the worst revolver on the list to not use gate loading, it still manages to be the best of the questionable revolvers. Tier 3 covers the revolvers which go beyond just being better alternatives to poorer models, start to stand on their own 2 legs as being worth using in their own right. These revolvers all achieved a score of 13 points, and while not the best, are more likely to save their user in the field of battle than anything in the previous tiers. Succeeding the Mars 1873, this revolver essentially followed a somewhat similar formula, but was greatly improved compared to its father. The Mars 1892 uses a swing-out cylinder, and while being the worst revolver on this list to use a swing-out system, the Mars 1892 is still an adequate choice. It uses 8mm rounds, which, while equivalent to the 32 ACP in power, were more powerful than the 11mm of the Mars 1873, and the 1892 does this while being smokeless and double action. Overall, it is an upgrade to the 1873, but is still fairly underpowered compared to the other fast-loading revolvers on this list. The Rodeo is a decent revolver. It chambers 10.4mm Italian ordnance rounds, which it shared with the earlier Glisenti 1874, and is a double action too, making it the best of both worlds. The Bodeo was so popular in fact that many Italian troops rejected their new Glisenti M9010 pistols in favour of the old but reliable Bodeo. It does have flaws though. Besides using a folding trigger, the weapon reloads via a gate loading mechanism on a 6-round cylinder, which is fairly slow to reload compared to every other revolver in Italian service at this time. The original Enfield revolvers chambered black powder rounds in a .476 caliber and were double action gate loaders similar to the Bodeo. This is the second British revolver on the list, and compared to the Bulldog, the Enfield has a high capacity, high caliber rounds, but ultimately the weapons are very similar in terms of reload mechanism and action. Even while using proprietary black powder cartridges, the Enfield is still new enough to be in the same league as revolvers like the Bodeo, despite arguably being one of the worst British revolvers. Used by the Russians, Turks and British primarily, the Smith & Wesson No. 3 was the most common revolver of the Great War by sheer prevalence as well as influence on other designs. Chambered in 44 Russian, 44-40 and even 4.55 in some cases, this weapon was a simple single action with a fast loading break-top extraction method. While slow to fire, old and using primitive black powder rounds, No. 3 was quick to reload and had been a favourite since its inception in 1870. This revolver is the last on the list to feature a single action design. This Japanese revolver saw usage by Japan and Siam, and while a fairly niche and unseen weapon in terms of World War I media, it certainly did see production in the 50,000 range and was fairly influential in the direction of Japanese revolvers later on. It used a smokeless 9mm cartridge, similar in dimension to the American 38 Special, and was a double action with a top brake system. The weapon is arguably the best of the adequate tier revolvers because of its somewhat modern design. That being said though, the weapon suffers from its 9mm caliber being smaller than some of the more popular 10 to 11mm weapons that would be produced by the British and the Americans. It also suffers from using a proprietary cartridge. This tier covers the revolvers which scored 14 or 15. The majority of these pistols are fairly new and often feature modern design choices as a result. Compared to the first 3 tiers, these revolvers have a decisive edge in battle and as a result are more optimal. While probably not better than the pistols of their time, these revolvers were better than average. The Rastengasser 1898 is the last revolver on this list to feature a gate loading mechanism and also the last revolver on the list to feature a cartridge smaller than 9mm, the 8mm Gasser. With these downsides, what makes the Rastengasser worthy of being in the good tier? It's a double action with an 8-round barrel, 2 features which automatically make it better than the Russian Nagant. But not only that, the 1898 shares its cartridge with converted Mauser pistols and its rounds are smokeless. So overall, the positives do somewhat outweigh the negatives, but it is also important to consider how slowly this revolver actually reloads and that its stopping power likely isn't the greatest. These Colt revolvers were best known for being double action, swing out revolvers chambering 38 and 41 long Colt primarily, featuring black powder ammunition and 6-round cylinders. The 1889 is famous for being the first revolver to feature a swing out cylinder, making these revolvers a good choice primarily for their speed of both reloading and firing. Careful consideration must be made regarding the ammunition they use though, as the 38 long Colt is fairly old and its firepower was so questionable that the US Army had to replace it with the 45 ACP round. This Spanish revolver saw usage with the Italians and the French in World War I. And compared to both the Italian and French offerings, the Orbea or Ono was well regarded. It was chambered in 11mm and is essentially a shorter double-action No. 3 revolver. Of course it wasn't perfect since it uses black powder rounds, but it loaded fast and fired fast while retaining high power rounds and is a perfectly serviceable alternative. Going by many names, the M1899 was the most produced revolver of the 20th century. This iconic 38 Special revolver saw some usage in World War I and is ultimately just an upgraded version of the Colt M1889 with smokeless rounds. It's also slightly newer too, but is held back just a tiny bit due to the weapon exclusively using 38 caliber cartridges. As for the Colt official place, the Colt official place is fundamentally the same revolver. These final revolvers are the best choices, scoring the highest in the range of 16 to 18 points. They are all relatively new, feature fast loading designs and powerful smokeless cartridges. The Webley Mark 6 and Webley Fosbury are both cut from the same cloth and they both use the newest smokeless 4.55 Webley rounds on double action platforms. The Webley Fosbury of course being sort of like the Mauser C78 and the few were produced and were mainly used by officers as private purchase weapons. Essentially they have high stopping power, fire fast and reload fast thanks to the top brake design with its automatic ejector. Referred to by Elmer Keefe as the finest revolver ever made, the 44 Special Smith & Wesson Triple Lock features all the most desirable features a revolver could have in the early 20th century. In particular, it has a swing-out cylinder, a double-action trigger, and it chambers a powerful 44 caliber round. British versions were even chambered in 4.55 Webley. This revolver was arguably the best revolver a British officer could have used in the trenches, thanks to how modern and ahead of its time it was. The only thing holding this revolver back from being worth 19 points is that it lacks the capacity of 7 rounds or more present on some niche revolver examples from the time. The M1917 revolvers came with fast loading moon clips, and perhaps their greatest claim to fame is that they chamber 45 ACP as a means to replace the M1911 pistol during shortages after the US entered the Great War in 1917. Everything else about this revolver is more or less perfect for trench combat: swing out cylinder for quick reloading, 45 ACP for stopping power, and a double action trigger for fast firing, and its cartridge was both powerful and modern. So to conclude, the worst revolvers of the Great War tended to be those with slow reloading mechanisms and single action triggers, since they were archaic and outmatched in many regards by the newer semi-automatic pistols of the time, speed, and smokeless revolvers for power. The best revolvers tended to be British or American, due to the British being slow adopters of semi-automatic pistols, and the Americans having nearly 100 years of experience of revolving handguns by the time of the Great War. The worst revolvers tended to come from the German and French-speaking worlds, as Central Europe had started to shift more and more towards semi-automatic designs years before. Thank you for watching Emu Ridge. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one.